For over 200 years, Japan was basically a world unto itself. It was this society of samurai and shoguns completely and intentionally locked away from the rest of the planet. But then, in the span of a single lifetime, it transformed from a feudal kingdom into a modern industrial power. This is the incredible story of how a nation was forced to change absolutely everything all at once. So, we're going to trace this wild journey in 5 main parts. We'll start by looking at the isolated world of Tokugawa Japan, then witness the shocking arrival of the West. From there, we'll track the collapse of that old government, dive into the frantic race to modernize, and finally, see the birth of a completely new Japanese identity. All right, first things first. To really get what's about to happen, we need to understand the world that was about to be shattered. For more than 2 centuries, Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate was like a society frozen in time, deliberately and totally cut off from the outside world. And this quote from an early Western visitor just nails it. It really captures that feeling of sheer alienness they felt when they arrived. To them, Japan wasn't just, a little different. Its social rules, its politics, its entire way of life seemed to operate on completely opposite principles from anything they knew. And right at the heart of this reverse world was a pretty confusing dual government. So you had the emperor living in Kyoto. He was seen as this divine figurehead, a literal descendant of the sun goddess. But he had no real political power. None. The person actually running the show was the shogun, a military dictator based in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, and he held all the executive power. So how did the shogun keep this whole system running for so long? Well, it all came down to this one crucial policy, Sokoku, which literally means locked country. For over 200 years, foreigners were forbidden from entering Japan, and Japanese people were forbidden from leaving, and the penalty was death. The whole goal was to prevent the influence of foreign ideas, especially Christianity, which the shogunate saw as a massive threat to its absolute control. But, walls like that can't last forever. This carefully constructed bubble of isolation was about to be blown completely apart. A new, very determined Western power was coming over the horizon, and its arrival was going to change absolutely everything. Just try to imagine the shock. One morning, you look out into the bay of the nation's capital, and you see 4 massive warships, belching black smoke and moving against the wind without sails. The Japanese had never seen anything like a steamship before. These weren't just ships. They were a terrifying demonstration of a technology so advanced it seemed almost demonic. And the guy in charge, Commodore Perry, he was no fool. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't there to ask, he was there to demand. He completely refused to deal with any low-level officials and basically presented an ultimatum: open Japan for trade or face the consequences. This whole strategy of intimidation, it became known as gunboat diplomacy. So, with its totally outdated military, the shogunate really had no choice. They had to buckle. The first deal, the Treaty of Kanagawa, was pretty modest, but it opened the floodgates. Just a few years later, in 1858, the Harris Treaty forced Japan to open more ports, set low taxes that it couldn't control, and worst of all, it granted something called extraterritoriality. This meant that if an American committed a crime in Japan, he'd be tried by an American court under American laws, not Japanese ones. It was a massive, profound insult to Japan's sovereignty. And that humiliation, wow, it sent a massive shockwave through Japanese society. The shogun's complete failure to protect the nation just shattered his legitimacy. It triggered a period of total chaos that would bring a 250-year-old government to its knees. So this brings us to the big question of this whole era, right? How could a system that kept the peace for centuries just crumble in a little over a decade? Well, the answer is basically a perfect storm of pressure from the outside and decay on the inside. Okay, so here's the key thing to get. Perry didn't cause the collapse. He was just the spark that lit the fuse. The shogunate was already getting weak. It had serious economic problems, there was a lot of corruption. So when they completely failed to stand up to the foreigners, that was the final straw. Foreign trade came in, wrecked the economy, and tons of samurai who were already struggling financially, they blamed the government for all of it. All that anger and frustration had to go somewhere, and it found the perfect rallying cry in this powerful new slogan, Sonno Joi, which means revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The idea was simple and powerful. The shogun has failed us, so we need to give power back to the divine emperor and kick these foreigners out. This movement was led by these powerful outer domains, especially Choshu and Satsuma. So, eventually, all this political conflict just boiled over into a full-blown civil war. But here's the kicker. This wasn't a war of samurai swords. The Choshu and Satsuma domains had been secretly adopting Western military tech and tactics. Their modernized army completely rolled over the shogun's more traditional forces, and just like that, centuries of Tokugawa rule were over. So the shogun is out, and power is restored to the young Emperor Meiji. But the new guys in charge, the very same samurai from Choshu and Satsuma who had just fought to expel the barbarians, faced a terrifying new reality. They realized Japan had to modernize, and it had to do it fast, or it was going to end up colonized, just like the rest of Asia. The new government immediately laid out its game plan in a document called the Charter Oath, and it was revolutionary. It promised to break away from the entire feudal past. But the most important article, the one that really drove everything, was the fifth one. Knowledge shall be sought throughout the world. That became the core principle of the entire Meiji era. And they boiled this whole idea down to another famous slogan, Fukoku Kyohei, which means enrich the country, strengthen the military. Every single reform, everything from building railways and telegraph lines to creating a brand new education system, was aimed at this one goal, making Japan rich enough and strong enough to stand on equal terms with the West. But you can't build a new nation without tearing the old one down. And this meant the systematic dismantling of the samurai class itself. In just 5 years, this warrior elite lost literally everything. Their feudal lands, gone, replaced by modern prefectures. A new conscript army made up of commoners ended their monopoly on warfare. Their hereditary salaries were taken away. And then came the final symbolic blow. They were forbidden from wearing their 2 swords in public, the very soul of their identity. The political transformation was just as radical. After studying a bunch of Western governments, Japan adopted a constitution modeled on Prussia's, of all places. It created a parliament, called the Diet, and a modern cabinet system. But, and this is important, real power was very carefully kept in the hands of the emperor and that small group of powerful men who had led the restoration. Okay, so we've got this massive political and economic revolution happening, but it was matched by an equally profound upheaval in culture and society, as Japan just started to eagerly absorb everything the West had to offer. They called this period Bunmei Kaika, which means civilization and enlightenment. And man, it was a whirlwind. Suddenly, everything Western was in vogue. You had samurai cutting off their traditional top knots, government officials started wearing suits and top hats, and the entire nation just embraced Western science, calendars, and educational models with incredible speed. But, as you can imagine, this rapid change created some deep fractures. The new leadership actually split over a really core question of national identity. Should Japan prove its strength the old-fashioned way, through military conquest, like invading Korea? Or should it focus on internal, modern development? In the end, the modernizers won out, but that conflict just simmered. And eventually, it erupted into the last great samurai uprising, the Satsuma Rebellion. And that brings us to the final piece of this transformation puzzle, religion. Remember how Christianity was one of the core reasons for Japan's isolation in the first place? Well, that centuries-old ban was finally lifted. Now, while very few Japanese actually converted, allowing missionaries was a huge symbolic step. It was a signal to the entire world that the old, locked country was gone, and a new Japan was ready to join the community of nations. So let's just step back and look at the big picture here. In less than a single lifetime, Japan went from a medieval society to a modern empire strong enough to defeat China in a war by 1895. It's truly one of the most astonishing, rapid transformations in all of human history. And it raises a really powerful question. What happens, both for better and for worse, when an entire country is forced to reinvent itself overnight?